All right, let's dive right in. What if I told you that the two deadliest wars in all of human history weren't really two separate wars at all? What if they were actually just one long 30-year conflict with a brief, fragile pause in the middle? In this session, we're going to analyze that exact idea, the chain of causation that connects everything in this era of global conflict. We're going to trace the path from these old crumbling empires all the way to a world split in two by the Cold War.
So, here's our learning plan for today. We're going to break this down into 5 key parts. We'll start with the crumbling world order, move through World War I, that flawed peace, and then into World War II and its atrocities. By the end of this, you'll be able to construct a solid argument explaining how all these monumental events are fundamentally linked. And that's a skill that's not just going to help you on the AP exam, it's going to help you understand the world we're living in right now. Okay, so let's set the stage. As we roll into the 20th century, the world is on a knife's edge. The big land-based empires that had been around for centuries, the Ottomans, the Russians, the Qing dynasty in China, they were really starting to show their age. They were decaying from the inside, creating this massive power vacuum that was just begging to be filled with chaos. And this map right here is a perfect snapshot of that decay. Just look at the Ottoman Empire. For years, people had been calling it the sick man of Europe. And you can see why. It's losing its grip on all this territory in the Balkans right before World War I kicks off. This area becomes a total tinderbox of nationalism, with all these different ethnic groups dreaming of having their own nations.
So how did Europe get to this breaking point? Well, historians have this super handy acronym to help us remember the long-term causes. MAIN. M is for militarism. Think of it as a massive arms race, everyone building bigger armies and navies. A is for alliances, this tangled web of treaties that basically split Europe into two armed camps. I is for imperialism, that frantic scramble for colonies and resources that pitted all the major powers against each other. And finally, N is for nationalism, this really intense aggressive patriotism that was tearing empires apart from the inside out.
And this map just shows you how dangerous that division was. You've got the Allied powers in green and the Central powers in purple. This system was so rigid that it basically guaranteed that any little spark, any regional conflict, would set off a domino effect, dragging the entire continent into war. And that's exactly what happened after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Okay, time for you to think like a historian. Go ahead and pause the video. I want you to think about those 4 MAIN causes and decide which one you think was the most significant factor. There's no single right answer here, but the key is to back up your claim with evidence. For instance, you could argue nationalism was the main driver because it fueled both the internal decay of empires and the external rivalries between nations. Go on, give it a shot. So the assassination was the spark, and the MAIN causes were the powder keg. But what came next, what made the explosion so catastrophic, was the fact that this was a completely new kind of war. This was total war, and it was about to change everything. Just look at this image. This is what was left of a forest on the Western Front. It's just a hellscape. This is what trench warfare and new military technology did. It turned vibrant landscapes into these muddy, crater-filled wastelands. It was a kind of destruction that no one had ever seen before. And this new kind of conflict gets a name, total war. This is a huge concept for this unit, so let's be clear on what it means. It's a war where the entire society is mobilized. Every person, every factory, every resource is directed towards the war effort. And crucially, the line between soldier and civilian completely blurs. Everyone is part of the war, and everyone is a potential target. The impact of total war was felt everywhere. Governments took over economies. They used propaganda to shape public opinion. Millions of soldiers were brought in from colonies in Africa and Asia to fight for their imperial rulers. And with so many men away at the front, women flooded into the workforce, taking on jobs in factories and farms, completely changing their role in society forever. So after 4 years of unimaginable slaughter, the war finally ends. The world is at peace. Or is it? Because in one of history's most tragic ironies, the treaty that was supposed to guarantee peace would actually become the direct cause of the next, even bigger war. Just look at the disconnect on this slide. The Treaty of Versailles had all these idealistic goals, lasting peace, self-determination, but the reality was so different. The infamous war guilt clause forced Germany to accept all the blame for the war, which was deeply humiliating. And the punishment didn't stop there. Germany was hit with reparations payments of around $33 billion, an absolutely impossible sum. To try and pay it, the German government just started printing money, which led to hyperinflation so bad that people's life savings became worthless overnight. This economic disaster created the perfect breeding ground for extremist ideas, like the poisonous stab in the back myth, this lie that Germany wasn't actually defeated, but was betrayed by its own politicians. And this wasn't just happening in Germany. The whole world was unstable. The Great Depression brings the global economy to its knees. The new League of Nations, which was supposed to prevent future wars, turns out to be totally toothless, unable to stop Japan or Italy from invading other countries. And into this vacuum of power and hope step these new, aggressive totalitarian ideologies, fascism, Nazism, promising to restore national greatness through any means necessary. Okay, let's practice another key AP skill. Pause the video and try to write a single solid thesis statement that connects the Treaty of Versailles to the outbreak of World War II. Remember, a good thesis makes a clear, defensible argument. You could try something like, although intended to secure peace, the Treaty of Versailles' punitive terms and economic penalties destabilized Germany, fostering a climate of resentment that directly enabled the rise of aggressive ideologies and led to a second global conflict. Go ahead and craft your own. And with that, the stage was set for Act 2. You really can't think of World War II as a totally separate event. It's more like the continuation of the First War, a final, horrifying settling of scores that were left unresolved back in 1918. And if the causes of World War II look familiar, well, they should. It's a direct echo of everything we just talked about. The disastrous peace treaty, the global economic crisis, the renewed imperial ambitions of countries like Japan, Italy, and of course, Nazi Germany, which saw war and conquest as their nation's destiny. This timeline really maps out that road back to war. You see Hitler coming to power in 1933, then a series of aggressive moves that went unchallenged. Then finally the invasion of Poland in 1939, and that's it. The world is at war again. But this war was different. It was even more total, and it was driven by ideologies of hate. It was defined by mass atrocities against civilians on an unimaginable scale. And at the dark heart of it all was the Holocaust, the systematic industrial-scale genocide of 6 million Jewish people. And we have to be clear, this wasn't just some tragic side effect of the war. For the Nazis, it was a central goal of the war. So we've seen this descent into darkness twice in just a few decades. How do we make sense of it all? The key, and this is so important for AP World, is to stop seeing these as separate events and start seeing them as links in a chain of cause and effect. Each event is a consequence of what came before it and a cause of what came next. And this slide lays out that tragic chain perfectly. You start with the crumbling world order, that leads to the explosion of World War I, the flawed peace treaty that ends it creates deep resentment, that resentment combined with economic collapse fuels the rise of fascism, and that in turn leads directly to an even deadlier World War II. It's one long, connected story. And the chain doesn't even stop there. The end of World War II just forges the next link. The old European empires are shattered for good, and rising from the ashes are two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The end of this hot war is the direct cause of the next great global conflict, the Cold War. This quote gets at how the system in place in 1914 made a world war almost inevitable. So for your own self-assessment, think about this. What was the most significant continuity in how global conflicts were fought between 1914 and 1945? Was it the technology, the ideologies, or that concept of total war itself? Think about how that thread connects the whole period. And that leads us to one final big question to chew on. Was the Cold War just the next logical, inevitable link in the chain, or could a different outcome at the end of World War II, a different kind of peace, have prevented another 50 years of global tension? There's no easy answer, but asking questions like that is what doing history is all about. All right, in this session, we're going to be analyzing the tangled histories of the Cold War and decolonization. We're talking about the period from 1900 to the present, a time when the world map was just completely redrawn. We're going to break this down into 6 parts, exploring how a totally new global order clawed its way out of the ashes of old empires and the collision of new, powerful ideologies. And by the end of this, you'll be able to explain the causes and effects of this era's huge conflicts, its independence movements, and, of course, the collapse of that two-sided bipolar world order. So here's our game plan. We'll start with how the world split in two, then see how that Cold War turned hot, and how at the exact same time empires were crumbling. Look at the countries that tried to find a third way, see how cracks started to form in both power blocks, and finally, watch as the Berlin Wall comes crashing down. Let's get started.
Okay, so after World War II, the world was just a different place. The old European empires were collapsing, leaving this massive power vacuum, and stepping right into it were two brand new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, who couldn't have been more different. This really set the stage for a new kind of global fight. And this right here, this is the heart of the conflict. On one side, you have the US and its allies, all about free market capitalism and individual freedoms. On the other side, the Soviet Union, promising a totally different path, one where the state controls everything to create economic and racial equality. And you have to understand, these weren't just, different policy ideas. No, these were completely incompatible visions for how society should even work. A global showdown was pretty much inevitable.
And Winston Churchill just nailed it with his famous phrase. It perfectly captured the new reality. An Iron Curtain had split Europe in two. And this wasn't just some fancy metaphor. It meant real, fortified borders. It meant political repression in the East, which was dominated by the Soviets, and a stark division from the US-backed Western Bloc.
So what was the US supposed to do about this? Well, their answer was a policy that would shape everything for the next 50 years. Containment. The thinking wasn't really to, roll back communism where it already was. The main goal was to contain it, to keep it from spreading, using a mix of economic help, like the Marshall Plan in Europe, and strong military alliances.
But here's the thing. This ideological fight didn't stay cold for long. Not at all. While the big two, the US and the USSR, managed to avoid a direct, planet-ending nuclear war, their conflict exploded into very real, very bloody wars all across the globe. And the main way this happened was through something called a proxy war. Basically, the US and the Soviet Union would pick sides in a local conflict, then pour in weapons, money, and support. This turned things like civil wars and independence movements into battlegrounds for their own global fight. It let them fight each other indirectly, but the cost for the countries caught in the middle was just devastating.
This map just lays it all out, doesn't it? Picture the world, split right down the middle. You've got NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was the military alliance led by the US, and on the other side, you've got its Soviet rival, the Warsaw Pact, which bound all the Eastern Bloc nations together. These two alliances made that bipolar world official and really raised the stakes for any conflict anywhere.
And these three are some of the biggest flashpoints. Notice a pattern here? They're all in Asia, which became a huge battleground after China went communist in 1949. So in Korea, in Vietnam, and later in Afghanistan, you see these local fights over national identity get totally transformed into these massive, brutal international wars. For the US, this was the bloody reality of its containment policy.
Okay, so while the superpowers are locked in this global chess match, there's another, equally massive historical force just erupting across the planet. At the exact same time, the old European colonial empires were falling apart at incredible speed in this process we call decolonization.
I mean, just look at the contrast on this slide. On the left, that's Africa in 1914, basically a patchwork quilt of European colonies. Now look at the map on the right, a continent of independent countries. This change, which happened in just a few decades after World War II, is seriously one of the fastest and most profound shifts in global politics ever. Now what's so important to get here is that there was no single way to get free. It really depended on who the colonizer was and what was happening on the ground. You had India getting its independence from Britain, mostly through nonviolent protest. But then you had Algeria, whose path to freedom from France was a long, incredibly brutal war. What they all had in common, though, were these powerful nationalist movements that got millions of people involved.
Okay, this is the perfect time to practice a key AP skill. Go ahead and pause the explainer. I want you to try and write one single thesis statement that compares how decolonization happened in India and Algeria. Really think about what they had in common and what made them so different. So, a great thesis, like the one on your screen, does two things really well. First, it points out a similarity. In this case, they both wanted independence from European power. But then, it clearly states the key difference. Their methods were worlds apart. That's the kind of sharp analytical thinking you want to bring to the exam. So as all these new countries pop up on the world map, they're immediately faced with this huge question. Should we side with the US or with the USSR? Well, a lot of them looked at that choice and said, no thanks. They refused to be pawns in someone else's game and tried to carve out their own path. And this is what led to the non-aligned movement. Now, this wasn't a military bloc like NATO. It was more like a club, a powerful forum where all these newly independent states could stand together and assert their neutrality. It was their way of saying, we're in charge of our own destiny, and we're not going to be pulled into your superpower drama. And leaders like India's Nehru were absolute masters at this. They skillfully played the two sides off each other. This strategy meant these new nations became a whole different kind of Cold War battleground. This one wasn't fought with armies, but with things like economic aid, big infrastructure projects, and diplomatic maneuvering, as both the US and the USSR tried to win them over. It's really easy to think of the Cold War world as these two giant, solid blocks staring each other down. But the reality, it was way more complicated. The superpowers started facing major challenges, not just from the outside, but from deep within their own teams. Over in the East, you had these massive popular uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, where people demanded more freedom, but they were brutally crushed by Soviet tanks. But maybe even bigger was the split between the two communist giants, the Soviet Union and China. They had a huge falling out over ideology. The Sino-Soviet split was like a geopolitical earthquake. It totally shattered the myth of a single unified communist world, which, by the way, created a huge strategic opening for the United States down the road. By the time we get to the 1980s, the Soviet system is really starting to buckle. Its economy was a mess, it was stuck in a super expensive war in Afghanistan, and it was trying to keep up with an insane arms race with the US. This mix of internal rot and external pressure led to a collapse that happened with stunning speed. And this timeline just shows how fast it all went down. It really kicks off in 1985, when the new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, introduces these two big reforms. Glasnost, which means openness, and allowed people to actually criticize the government, and perestroika, which was a restructuring of their failing economy. The problem was, these reforms accidentally opened a Pandora's box of democratic and nationalist feelings. By 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and just 2 years after that, the Soviet Union itself was gone. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it didn't magically create a world without problems. Not at all. Instead, it just revealed a whole different set of global divides. And this map shows one of the biggest legacies of that whole colonial and Cold War era. This huge economic gap between the industrialized global north and the developing global south. A deep inequality that is absolutely still with us today. Okay, let's boil all of this down. What are the key things you have to remember? First, the Cold War was the ideological fight of the second half of the 20th century. Second, decolonization was happening at the same time and was just as powerful, redrawing the entire world map. And these two things were completely connected. And finally, the end of the Cold War didn't mean the end of conflict. It just shuffled the deck, leaving us with the incredibly complex world we see today. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. As you keep studying this period, I want you to really assess how the legacies of all this, of colonialism, of the Cold War alliances, are still shaping our modern world. How do they influence economic inequality, political chaos, and conflict today? In other words, how is the history we just talked about still alive and kicking, shaping the world you're living in right now?
All right, let's dive into our final unit of AP World History Modern, Globalization. We are going to tackle the forces that have completely reshaped our world since 1900, creating the incredibly interconnected, complex, and, often controversial planet that we all live on today. And what better place to start than with something you probably see every day, this can of Coca-Cola. It's available in all but 2 countries on Earth, which is wild when you think about it. It perfectly captures what we're talking about today: connection, economic integration, cultural exchange, and, of course, the controversies that bubble up alongside them. It's more than a drink, it's a symbol of a process with huge benefits and some really significant costs. So here's our learning plan for this session. We're not just going to list a bunch of facts. We are building an argument about our modern interconnected world. We'll break this down into a few key themes. By the end, you'll be able to evaluate the causes and effects of globalization and really analyze the different ways people have responded to it. And here's the roadmap we'll follow. We'll kick things off with what historians call the Great Acceleration, this insane pickup in the pace of change. Then, we'll dig into our major themes, always keeping an eye on the tensions and dualities that really define this whole era. Okay, let's jump in. The period after 1900, and especially after World War II, saw this absolutely unprecedented acceleration in how humans interact. You could say that our fundamental relationship with time and space was just radically changed. Think about it. New technologies in communication, transportation, and medicine didn't just tweak daily life. They fundamentally shrank the planet. That first wireless signal in 1901 made the Atlantic Ocean feel like a pond. The polio vaccine wasn't just a national achievement, it was a global health breakthrough. And then, of course, the internet came along and created a whole new dimension for human connection. But here's the thing. Every single aspect of this acceleration is a two-sided coin. Let's start with technology. It's an incredible connector, but it can also be a vehicle for contagion, both literally and figuratively. So back in the 1980s, you had these things called bulletin board systems, or BBS. They were these early computer networks. Slow, local, mostly text. You could build a small community, but it was really limited. Flash forward just a few decades and social media can rally millions of people for protests like the Arab Spring in 2011, literally toppling governments and redrawing political maps. The scale of change is just staggering. So here's the crucial takeaway. The very same networks that connect us for good can also be used to spread disease or act as tools of state control. The infrastructure that enables a democratic movement is the exact same one that allows for government surveillance. This duality, this tension, is a core theme you have to understand for Unit 9. Okay, time to put on your historian hat. I want you to pause this explainer right now and apply that same two-sided coin idea to transportation. Think about jet travel, which just exploded after the mid-20th century. What's one big positive and one big negative consequence of all that hypermobility? Go ahead and pause. So if you jotted down something like increased trade and tourism as a positive, and maybe the rapid spread of viruses like COVID-19 or a huge carbon footprint as a negative, you are exactly on the right track. That ability to analyze both the good and the bad, the causes and effects, that's the complex thinking you need for this unit. All right, let's shift gears to the engine of globalization, economics. This is where we see free market principles, mostly pushed by the West after the Cold War, really go global. And the main player in this new global economy is the multinational corporation, or the MNC. Now, these aren't totally new. You could think of the British East India Company, right? But the scale, the speed, and the sheer influence of MNCs in the late 20th century is just off the charts. And this map just illustrates their impact perfectly. After Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the late 70s, China opened up its economy. I want you to picture the flow of capital, money pouring in from the US, Japan, and Europe. It flows right into these coastal cities like Shenzhen, building massive factories that turn China into the world's factory and lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's a stunning transformation. But let's flip that coin. The immense power of these MNCs has also sparked a lot of resistance. This quote about our old friend Coca-Cola points to accusations of exploiting workers, damaging local environments, and breaking up unions in developing countries. And that's the tension right there. Global economic integration versus local resistance. Of course, all of this economic expansion came at a massive cost to our planet, creating yet another major tension. The scale of human impact on the environment since 1900 is just, well, it's unlike anything in all of prior history. On the one hand, you have these incredible moments of progress. Take the Green Revolution in the 50s and 60s. With its high-yield seeds and chemical fertilizers, it was a huge success. It fought off famine, saved millions of lives, especially in the developing world. It was a genuine scientific triumph. But the other side of that coin was some severe environmental damage. The very success of these new crops actually reduced biodiversity, which makes our global food supply more vulnerable. The chemical runoff polluted water and soil, and the whole system depended on fossil fuels, which, as we now know, directly contributes to global warming and climate change. And in response to this, a powerful new social movement was born. It was sparked by scientists and writers like Rachel Carson. Her book Silent Spring was a bombshell that exposed the dangers of pesticides. Environmentalism grew into a global political force, demanding that governments and corporations finally deal with these crises. Okay, let's pivot to culture, which is maybe one of the most hotly debated parts of globalization. The big question is, has it created one single universal culture, or has it actually empowered unique local ones? For a long time, especially in the late 20th century, a lot of people were worried that the global dominance of US brands and media would just erase local cultures. This process was often called Americanization. You know, Hollywood movies, pop music, fast food, they were everywhere, raising real fears about losing local traditions. But is it really a one-way street? Is globalization just another word for Americanization? I want you to pause the explainer right now and challenge that idea. Think of a movie, a type of music, a food, anything that has gone global from somewhere outside the United States. So if you thought of examples like anime, K-pop, or maybe even Squid Game, you are exactly right. What's so fascinating here is that this shows globalization is a multi-directional flow. It's a cultural conversation, not a monologue. It creates these amazing hybrid cultures. I mean, K-pop itself borrows from American hip-hop, mixes it into something new, and then exports it back to America as a huge phenomenon. That's cultural sharing, not just cultural domination. So finally, how have humans tried to manage this incredibly complex, interconnected system? The answer is by creating brand new global and regional institutions. Coming out of the wreckage of World War II, world leaders created these huge supranational organizations like the United Nations to try and manage global politics and human rights. On the economic side, you get institutions like GATT and later the World Trade Organization, all designed to lower trade barriers and promote free market capitalism. Now, whether these institutions are effective or even fair remains a subject of intense debate to this day. So we end by turning the lens back on you. And this question is a really powerful one, because globalization isn't just some abstract historical process happening out there. It is the very fabric of your daily life. So if there's one thing you take away from this entire unit, it's this. Globalization is defined by tension. It's always connection versus contagion, integration versus resistance, progress versus peril, universal culture versus unique identity. Understanding these dualities, these constant push and pull dynamics, is the absolute key to mastering this topic for the AP exam. So for your final self-assessment, I want you to use this lens. Look at the tag on your shirt, think about where the food you ate today came from, or look at the top story on your newsfeed. Then analyze how that one single item represents both the incredible interconnectedness and the deep tensions that we talked about.